The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes after him with 20,000? If he cannot, then, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. It occurred to me as I was listening to the lessons today and doing a little math in my head with the calendar that frequently these readings land not on Rally Sunday, but on Labor Day weekend. They're a bit challenging for a day like today. I don't know if you ever have the experience of listening to the scriptures and knowing that at the end your response is supposed to be, "Thanks be to God." But as you listen to the scriptures, you start having this kind of sinking suspicion that it's going to be really hard to say that. Thanks be to God. Indeed, today is one of those days when we hear Jesus saying things that are pretty challenging. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a teaching. And that teaching is that everything is transient. Everything has a beginning and a time when it flourishes, and then a time when it decays and goes away. They have a special word for that. I can't pronounce it correctly, so we're not going to go there. But the point for people who are within that tradition or holding to it is that in many ways we find ourselves in a position where we find ourselves clinging to those things that are transient. And the more we cling to those things and the more they go away, that often is the source for suffering in that tradition, in their understanding. That suffering comes from clinging to things that are going to come and they're going to go away. And if you cling to those kinds of things, well, then you find yourself struggling. So part of the teaching is to live with what they call equanimity, kind of to live with that posture of holding on loosely in such a way that when things like that come to pass, you haven't been particularly attached to it. And you can allow it to happen. Accept it. Now, in his book, Giving to God, Mark Allen Powell begins his introduction by talking about another way of thinking about these kinds of things. And he's talking about the Gauls and the process by which they came into the Christian faith. Listen to this. Mark Allen Powell writes, "The Gauls were a warlike people who in ancient times inhabited what is now France and Belgium. They spoke a Celtic language and were Druidic in religion. By the time of the Christian era, they had been conquered by the Roman Empire and were supposedly under its control. The extent of this control varied, however, for the Gauls never did take too well to being conquered, and there were numerous Gallic uprisings. A number of Christian missionaries ventured into the Gallic territory, and over time, many of the Gauls became Christians. As the story goes, when a converted warrior was baptized in a river or stream, he would hold one arm high in the air as the missionary dunked him under the water. This seemed a peculiar custom, and the missionaries soon learned the reason for it. When the next battle or skirmish broke out, the warlike Gaul would raise that arm and say, "This arm is not baptized," and then proceed to pick up their club or their sword or their axe and go off to war to do the most unchristian of things. Mark Allen Powell points out that this may just be myth. Its historicity may not be true, but there's something about it that speaks a truth about the way humans often operate. There are ways in which people often want to take some part of their life, some part of themselves, and they want to hold it out of the water and say, "This hasn't been baptized," so that they can pull it out at their convenience. People tend to want to protect some part of themselves from the touch of God, as though somehow God doesn't care about all of who they are, as if God doesn't care about all of what they do, as if God doesn't care about all that they have. There are ways in which people would like to reserve parts of themselves from the touch of the kingdom of God. And is that not what Jesus is talking about today? As Jesus has been traveling to Jerusalem, remember, quite a way back in the gospel, Jesus, it says, turned his face toward Jerusalem and started making his way to Jerusalem. And we know what that means. He is moving towards that final climax in the story of his life, that moment when he faces the ultimate challenge. And they put him up on the cross. And God wins the day in the resurrection. We know that's the story. But Jesus has been traveling that path to Jerusalem, and on the way, he has been teaching people what the reign of God looks like, what the kingdom of God looks like, and he has been teaching them what it means to be a disciple, a follower, a learner from him. And he has been showing them in his actions what that looks like. And in the midst of that, in the midst of all of that, Jesus then says, look, the reign of God is an all-in thing. He's already told people that indeed, if you start to follow me, other people are not going to be able to associate with you anymore. When I come, it brings not peace, which you expect, but it brings divisions. He's already told them that. And now today he says, look, if you're clinging to those kinship relationships, if you're clinging to those social relationships that you had before you entered into the reign of God, if you're clinging to the stuff that you bring with you, you're not going to be able to enter fully into what I have for you. The gifts that I have call you to a whole new kind of relationship. And it is a relationship that is mediated through the waters of baptism. It is a relationship that reorients everything and calls us into a new way of being, calls us to be attentive to those things that can distract us from paying attention to who God is and what God desires for us. It's a challenging teaching indeed. And indeed, on a day like this, when we have so much going on, Sunday school is starting, and there's all that exuberance of all those young people and some older people. Some of us who are chronologically gifted still come for opportunities to learn about who God is, huh? And giving Bibles to third graders and installing teachers. All of those kinds of things could distract us, and we could start to lose track of what God is calling us to. And one of the things we have to pay attention to is sometimes the gospel of Jesus Christ is articulated in ways that aren't particularly helpful. There are those who would tell you that the gospel and believing in Jesus means that you are going to be safe and you will not experience any pain or suffering, or that nothing bad will go wrong with you. Of course, the problem is then when you get sick, then it must be because your faith isn't good enough. There's a problem with that. There are others who tell you that following and being a disciple of Jesus Christ means that you're making a down payment for greater prosperity on down the line, and your offerings, whatever you put into the plate, is just a down payment for some larger return. Prosperity gospel, we call it. It's a problem. That's not what Jesus is promising with the gospel. What Jesus is promising is something much bigger. And it is something that is actually much more subversive. It calls us out of our old way of being and into a new way of being. And in that new way of being, what we encounter is the love of God. And that love of God reorients every part of who we are and what we have. It strengthens us and upholds us. And when we encounter that love, we start to recognize the ways that God is active in our midst and God is working for forgiveness. And as we experience that forgiveness, we recognize and experience reconciliation. Reconciliation with one another and reconciliation with God. And as we experience that reconciliation, in the midst of that reconciling act, we start to see that we have been called into newness of life. Newness of life through the waters of our baptism. I think it's a big deal. It's a huge promise for you.